Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first lecture of the Yu Ying-shih Lecture in History 2023-2024. To enhance cultural exchange and academic research, the Yu Ying-shih Lecture in History was established in 2007 and co-organized by the College and the Department of History of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. We would like to express our sincere gratitude to the Austin Eminence Charitable Foundation for sponsoring this year's lecture. This year, we are honored to have Professor Michael Puett, Klein, Professor of Chinese History and Anthropology, Harvard University, as our speaker. The topic of today's lecture is Comparative Approaches to the Study of Chinese Intellectual History, Reflections on the Work of Yu Ying-shih, and it will be moderated by Professor Zhang Yu, Associate Professor, Department of History, the Chinese University of Hong Kong. The lecture will now begin. May I invite Professor Zhang Yu to introduce our speaker, Professor Michael Puett. Professor Zhang, please.
I have the privilege to ask our MC I could sit here to do the introduction because that's more comfortable for me. I'm more or less an informal person. So, but thank you. And the MC just did say a lot of what I would like to say. So I wouldn't speak too much about the Professor Puett's background because I think everyone would quite familiar with sitting here about how acclaimed a scholar Professor Puett is. And I think when we read the brief biography in the leaflet, we see how his interest covers a lot of fields: religious, philosophical, historical, and modern fashion terms of call it cross-disciplinary. I think that's a word we cannot afford of missing it in any funding application forms right nowadays. But whatever, I think for today's talk, I would like to speak a bit few words about my yesterday experience about watching one of Professor Puett's video online. It's a video called The Path, which is delivered to the Google employee, the Google, Google, that company. So it's at Cambridge office, as I remember, right? Yes. So in that talk, I think it's a fascinating talk, which is around 1 hour duration. And Professor Puett, during that talk, he expressed to a very broad of audience, not specialists, I guess, for the very nature of Confucianism and how the Confucian writes and how it functions in the new reconstructing social relationship. I think that's a simply brilliant talk. And I highly recommend everyone who is interested in Chinese culture to, if you have the time and chance to listen to that talk. Yeah, it's just 1 hour. But today, we're not only talking about Confucius, the Asian Confucianism stuff. We are more talking about like a modern influential historian who is the reason why we're sitting here and also the reason behind the whole series of lectures. And that person, which I personally think has become a historical figure when he was still alive 2 years ago. So, but he left us 2 years ago. So everyone, of course, know who he is. He is Professor Yu Ying-shih. So today, Professor Puett will bring us a very interesting and I guess fascinating lecture about Professor Yu Ying-shih's his new reflections on the work of Professor Yu Ying-shih, and more importantly, comparative approaches to the study of Chinese intellectual history. Please join me to welcome Professor Puett.
Great, thank you so much for the much too nice introduction, but very deeply appreciated. And my deep thanks to CUHK for hosting the Yu Ying-shih Lecture, and my deep honor it is now to actually be delivering this year's lecture. I am a very, as you will see over the next 2 lectures, strong supporter of Yu Ying-shih. I've been deeply influenced by his work, and it is a tremendous honor for me to be here speaking in the lecture series devoted to him. So let me begin by saying a few words about how I got interested in Yu Ying-shih and how that led to the current project. So as you all know, Yu Ying-shih is one of those rare and extraordinary figures who was able to work across the entire Chinese intellectual tradition. So brilliant, groundbreaking works on everything from early China straight through 20th century China. And I, as many scholars, learned about him because of my own area of specialty. So I happened to work on early Chinese history, so I began by reading, of course, the great Yu Ying-shih's writings on early Chinese history. And they were truly great. I think the single first article by him that I read was his incredible work on Chinese notions of the afterlife, O Soul, Come Back, an incredible work that traced notions of the afterlife in the standard received texts and just presented them in a completely new way. And when I was reading this work, of course, this was at a point when we were getting tons and tons of new excavated materials. And what was so intriguing is these were materials that made, frankly, a lot of scholarship on early China look very outdated very quickly because we're getting new texts that these earlier analyses weren't discussing. And lo and behold, here was a work where, if anything, it was the exact opposite. The more we discovered about early Chinese notions of the afterlife, the more powerful I found Yu Ying-shih's arguments. It made it all the more intriguing why texts like the Li Ji were making the arguments they were making once we were learning more and more of the background. So if anything, his ideas became more powerful and more salient the more we learned. So I continued reading his works on early China. Then, I'm embarrassed to say, much, much later, I started reading his works from later periods of Chinese history. And it began to suddenly dawn on me, as it should have when I was a lowly graduate student many years before, that I had been missing something fundamental even in those early Chinese writings. That in fact, yes, he was saying startling, new, important things about early China. He was also making a very powerful larger argument too that I had missed entirely, I'm embarrassed to say. And so what I would like to do today is talk about that overall argument. Having now, many years later, read his corpus. I won't claim to have read everything he's written. He's written, truly, in fact, I would mention, I will interrupt my own sentence by saying people who have tried to compile a complete bibliography of Yu Ying-shih's works have found it almost impossible because he himself did not keep a bibliography. And so the people are constantly finding, oh, and by the way, it turns out he wrote this other piece and he wrote this other piece. So our listing of his bibliography keeps growing because there's no single pure listing of it all. So I therefore will not claim to have read everything, but I have read a lot of it. And what I would like to do today is give an argument as to what I think he is up to. In other words, what was his project? Why was he making the arguments he was making? Certainly about early China, but as we'll very quickly see, not only about early China. And if we take this project seriously, and I clearly think we should, what can we learn from it going forward? So to lay out this argument, what I would recommend is the following. Let me begin by saying a few words about how he presented himself as an historian. In other words, what were his own claims about being an historian? What did it mean for him to be an historian? How was he positioning himself vis-a-vis the historiographical tradition in China? And then once we've gotten a glimpse of that, that will, I hope, propel us into the next question, which is, how was he understanding Chinese history? How was he reading Chinese history, given the arguments he was trying to give and giving his own position? And again, concluding with what we can learn from this exercise and what we can learn from this life project. So to begin with that first question, how does he present his own work vis-a-vis the historiographical tradition in China? So he has many, many, many critiques of scholarship going on throughout the 20th century. Let me just begin with one of those, and we'll get to others as we get farther into the talk. But one of the arguments he will make is the following. The field of Chinese history, he will argue, has become divided between, this is in the 20th century, I mean, has become divided between two dominant approaches. In one of those approaches, the concern is with data, empirically accurate data. Now, Yu Ying-shih thinks this is wonderful. We should, of course, be accurate historians. But according to this argument, the concern is simply with coming up with an accurate understanding of what happened at what times in Chinese history, with no regard for, in fact, an active opposition to any sort of concern with the position of the historian, the placement of that historian in his or her own historical context, and posing the question of why we are choosing to read these materials as we are. That's problem one. Problem two, he argues, is on the other side of the spectrum. Problem two involves what he will call grand interpretations of the entirety of Chinese history. So unlike the former, which tends toward extreme specialization, obviously, this latter tends toward making grand arguments about Chinese history in general. Here, the argument is you find the exact opposite problem. The exact opposite problem being that people have imported largely Western categories for interpreting Chinese history. Those would include, of course, a Marxist notion of inherent teleological stages that every civilization must go through. Another one that he thinks is equally pernicious is any attempt to divide Chinese history into an ancient, medieval, modern divide, which of course comes directly from the study of Western history and is simply being applied to Chinese history. So one of his examples is Naitou's famous hypothesis that the Song dynasty begins modernity in China. And his argument is Naitou's a great historian, but yet the entire framework presupposes a medieval period from which modernity will arise. And the question is, when precisely did it occur in China, which for Yu Ying-shih is a very dangerous question because it is not based upon the proper questions an historian should ask. So if those are the two problems, in his opinion, sort of the spectrum of the positions he wants to oppose, he then will go to the next stage of his argument and say, they both share the exact same problem. Both of these positions are imports from Euro-American scholarship, specifically a scientific approach which mistakenly takes arguments developed from the sciences and thinks you can study human history without rethinking those approaches. Both, in other words, are committed to a view that you can have an objective understanding of history. It's simply that in one case, it's a view of a reductionistic set of data. In the other view, it's a scientific set of laws. Either way, it is an import from outside. Given that argument, the next stage, of course, makes sense, but let's follow out the full claim. So if this is the problem, the solution, he will argue, is let us look at the indigenous development of an historiographical tradition in China and ask if there are different ways of looking at Chinese history. The answer, of course, for him is definitively yes. And he will say then a few words about what that tradition is. So for Yu Ying-shih, the key moment in the development of the Chinese historiographical tradition is, and this opening move will not be surprising, but I mentioned it because it will be important for how he will develop his own genealogy. It is Confucius and the authorship of the Spring and Autumn Annals. And Yu Ying-shih will read that act based upon a commentarial tradition I will be getting to later that will say what Confucius was doing here was certainly giving a correct analysis of the state of Lu in the sense that everything that happens in the Spring and Autumn Annals presumably happened, so it's not made up. But what Confucius is doing here is taking specific events involving specific figures in specific historical situations and reading those figures normatively. Normatively meaning, to what degree did these figures, I keep dropping this. I will leave this right here. So I won't keep dropping the flowers because I will get more impassioned as we get farther into the talk. So the problem will only get worse. So reading then specific figures in specific historical situations and consistently trying to do so with the normative claim. How did those figures sense the historical situation they were living in? Did they respond effectively or not? And how can we, or in this case, Confucius, understand that? And can he write in a way that would allow other people reading this work to be trained to do the same thing? In other words, if we are, to give a not random example, in the Han Dynasty reading the Chunqiu, the Spring and Autumn Annals by Confucius, can we understand what Confucius is doing in the way he weaves his narration, the words he chooses, how he chooses to explain certain events and implicitly critique them? And as such, can we then take that same mode of reading and learn to understand critically our own moment by doing exactly what Confucius was doing in reading the history of the state of Lu? Then Yu Ying-shih will continue. Who builds most powerfully upon this vision of historiography? Again, the name will not surprise you, but let me follow out the argument because it will be very important for what Yu Ying-shih will claim to be doing. The next figure he turns to, again, not surprisingly, is Sima Qian. But again, Yu Ying-shih's reading of Sima Qian is the key moment here. The argument is Sima Qian is taking the next step from Confucius, not next step in the sense of developing a different methodology, rather the next step simply being that he lived in a different historical moment. Living in the early Han, Sima Qian, doing the same work Confucius was doing with the state of Lu, is trying to pose the same question: how can I understand the development of the entire historical process up to my day by looking at how specific figures in specific situations responded, what potentialities were opened up by those who responded effectively, what was closed down by those who responded poorly, and how can we both understand that historical process, but if we do this well, how can we also open up through that very act of reading possibilities for going forward? Because it is a different time period, it is a radically different genre. So if Confucius writes the Spring and Autumn Annals in this very tight, laconic style, Sima Qian, on the contrary, will write this massive, sprawling work covering the entirety of Chinese history, giving multiple perspectives of different events, generically a radically different work, but Yu Ying-shih will argue, doing the same kind of project, meaning that we, the latter born, ought to read this work as that, as taking events. Yes, it's accurate. He's not making things up, but taking events, reading it through this very complex lens that will open up possibilities for us if we see how those possibilities were opened up and closed off through that lengthy historical process. Now, it is very clear where Yu Ying-shih is going with this, but let me now lay it out because he's fairly explicit. What Yu Ying-shih wants to argue is one of the tragedies of 20th century China is this historiographical tradition is not gone. He thinks some people are practitioners of it, but he thinks it has been radically curtailed. And he clearly sees part of his own project as being a continuation of precisely this historiographical tradition. It is an historiographical tradition that he explicitly says is based inherently on moral and political critique, based upon a very complex reading of the tradition, and specifically doing it through a normative lens where you are seeing again what possibilities opened and were closed. More specifically, to get into a bit more of his language, which will be crucial for where we're going, the argument is, were we to do this, we would see that there is a pattern. The term, of course, is Li. He's pulling this from, we will see later the full genealogy, but he's pulling this from Jushi, later Wang Yangming's rereading, and he will, as we will see later, read pieces of this back into the early tradition. We will see there are patterns in Chinese history, and those patterns consist of things like, sure, right, potentialities, possibilities that are either opened up or closed depending on how people respond to the tradition. Accordingly, if we reread Chinese history, With this understanding, which by definition would be a rereading, we're reading it from the 20th century. If we're in Yu Ying-shih's shoes, we're going to be reading it differently by definition than a Sima Qian 2,000 years before. But if we are rereading the entire tradition, what we are doing is trying to trace out how we got to where we are, training ourselves through a close reading of these texts to see how to understand what they were doing, also seeing what potentialities were opened up and again, closed off with specific actions that were taken, all of which would be written, if it's done effectively, with the goal of opening up possibilities and potentials now. This, for him, is what an historian ought to be doing. As he also notes quite correctly, read this way, history in the Chinese tradition therefore becomes one of the foundational and single most important acts. It includes things that would otherwise, as for example in the Western tradition, to give an obvious example, be seen as separate activities. So in the West, you would have philosophers who would deal with philosophical ideas. You would have historians who would do careful historical analyses. According to this way of reading, Confucius, by definition, is absolutely a philosopher, but he does it through close historical readings. Sima Qian does the work of what we would call a philosopher through, again, historical readings. And needless to say, the implication is he, Yu Ying-shih, is hoping to do the same. This is a philosophical rereading of Chinese history, but it is done through an intensely close intellectual history of specific figures. This is what Yu Ying-shih wants to claim he is doing and how he is positioning himself vis-a-vis the entire tradition. He is continuing an indigenous practice of Chinese historiography that he feels has been largely cut off and he wants to revive. Now, if this is the case, it obviously raises the next key question, which is, what is this argument? In other words, what happens when he tries this very, very complicated rereading of Chinese history? Now, you might immediately be wondering as I pose this question, how long will this lecture be going on? I've been given 75 minutes. You might be thinking, does Michael think this is a 75-hour talk? Do not worry. I will keep it within the restricted time. So I will not try to give you all of Yu Ying-shih's readings, which are, again, absolutely extraordinary. But what I will strive to do is give you a few examples. The first one from the early period that I'll spend a bit more time on. And then once we see a lot of his key themes, I will be able to much more quickly, I assure you, take you through his later work moving into the 20th century, where again, I will not be able to give you the full picture, but I think we'll at least be able to see a lot of the themes he wants to articulate, and equally importantly, how he is trying to position his rereading, which again, for him would be different because he's in the 20th century, and as we'll quickly see, different as well because, of course, he has access to a comparative understanding of world history that, by definition, most figures before him would have had no access to. And for him, that, by definition, is something you have to take seriously if you're a 20th century historian. So let us jump into what his argument is. It is complicated, so let me begin by means of an example before I try to articulate the larger vision. I worry if I try to articulate it too quickly, it will lose so much nuance that too much of the power will be lost. So let me instead turn to one of his later books, not terribly late, but 2014. And this is a book he wrote that sort of summed up his reading of the early period. And it is a book that also had different versions in both Chinese and English since about 1997. And he's spoken many times saying actually he was even working on this a couple of decades before. So it's really his re-summary of what he wants to say for the early period. This, of course, is after the work he was doing that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk on conceptions of the afterlife. That was from a dissertation he had written at Harvard much, much earlier. This was his attempt to begin the larger project that I'm mentioning, begin chronologically speaking, again, it's relatively late. So the work I'm talking about, it's called the Lun Tianren Zhiji, so the discourse on the boundary between heaven and humanity. A book again that came out in 2014, different versions of which came out over about 2 decades before that. And let me give you first a very brief summary of the book and then take you through what he's trying to do. The first part of the summary involves yet another critique. So Yu Ying-shih is writing this in part as a critique of what had become a dominant way of reading not just early China, but really the entire Chinese tradition. That dominant position goes along the following lines. In China, there is a distinctive worldview based upon the idea that humans and heaven are inherently in harmony. That notion, according to a set of views that he is going to be critiquing very strongly, involves the following sets of claims. This is an assumption that emerges in early China. Some would argue, and he will critique some variations of this coming out of a much earlier shamanistic worldview. It is then articulated later into a correlative system involving 5 phases, yin-yang, etc. That correlative system, that vision of an organismic cosmos, continues as an assumption in Chinese history. It is in part broken up in the 20th century, but various figures he is looking at and critiquing want to say we need to revive this because a revival of this earlier worldview would mean a solution to the world's problems. For example, things like climate devastation, which was certainly already a problem very well known in the 20th century, would be solved because humans would see themselves as inherently a part of the natural world. And so you would have a solution to a lot of the problems of modernity by bringing back this worldview. Now, as we will see, Yu Ying-shih's critique here is not against all of what I just mentioned, but his critique is reading this as a worldview. The reason for this, as we will see, and this is going to be crucial for his entire way of reading, is he wants to say, if you read this as a worldview, it means people are simply born into this worldview, and you analyze the work they are doing as examples of this inherent way of thinking in Chinese history. For Yu Ying-shih, for reasons we've already begun to see, and we will see much more momentarily, this is incredibly dangerous because what you lose is the work of specific figures who will make specific arguments at specific moments, sometimes exactly along the lines of what I mentioned, but we must understand when and why they made these arguments, what potentials were opened up when they did it effectively, and again, as we will see, what potentials were closed off when they did it poorly. That is the work for Yu Ying-shih that matters. Accordingly, he will write a book to rethink the emergence of this notion. And that's even a dangerous way of putting it. He's not just rethinking the emergence of the notion, he really wants to rethink our understanding of how intellectual history operates. It's a very complicated book, but I'll just say a few brief words so that we can have a sense of what he's talking about to get into a little bit of the detail. So very briefly, the argument runs along the following lines. He notes quite correctly that many scholars making an argument along the lines I mentioned before will build it out of a story that comes from a text called the Goryu. And in that story, very, very briefly, the story is in distant antiquity, humans and gods had a proper relationship with each other. And at a certain moment, this was lost, and the proper relationship broke down, and there was no boundary between heaven and humanity. And then the early sage rulers, who become among the founders of Chinese civilization, come in and reestablish a proper relationship involving, among other things, figures called the Wu, which he, following other figures, will translate as shamans, but he will also just call them religious specialists. And these figures were the ones charged with properly working on the communication between heaven and the gods, between humans and the gods in heaven. Now, Yu Ying-shih will immediately say, this is not a story about the inherent harmony of humanity and the natural world. In fact, it has nothing to do with the natural world at all. It has to do with heaven. And the whole theme of it is in terms of communication. And if it is in terms of communication, the moral of the story is proper communication occurs when it is strongly restricted by a ruler who is in charge of a series of religious specialists who are given sole ability to connect with divine powers. And this breaks off the communication that anyone else would have to those divine powers, except via the mediation of these religious specialists under the explicit control of a ruler. In other words, we should read this not as a founding assumption from early China. It's not even representative of an assumption at all about humans in the natural world. It actually is, on the contrary, an argument in favor of a stratical restriction of communication and access between humans and the divine. For Yu Ying-shih, this actually is what a lot of the key figures he is going to be looking at are reacting against. And when he works out how they're reacting, note again the way he will do it. It is consistently in terms of how specific figures worked on specific aspects of this effectively or not. So I'll begin with an obviously effective one for Yu Ying-shih, Confucius. So what is Confucius doing? According to this reading, Confucius is actively breaking down that barrier, and he is breaking down the barrier by beginning what Yu Ying-shih will call an inward move toward transcendence, meaning that for Confucius, heaven becomes a constant companion, and he will quote, of course, lines from the Analects that will literally speak of this. Heaven becomes a constant companion to Confucius. Confucius will see himself as working out of an earlier ritual tradition, but he will place the key for that ritual tradition as being inner cultivation that will give you access to heaven, that is in potentia, I'll come back to why I use that term, open to those who so train themselves, and it is no longer restricted to religious specialists of any kind. And once he makes that move, only then, Yu Ying-shih will argue, do you begin the key for him interplay between a transcendental order and mundane lived reality that, in his opinion, will be worked out in a very specific and borderline unique way, comparatively speaking. Very specifically, the argument will be, this is when you get a notion of the Tao, which for Yu Ying-shih, when it's used effectively, means the following. If you are concerned with the Tao, and he thinks Confucius was one of the key figures who begins this process, what you are concerned with is something that is beyond the world that we are currently living in, not again in the kind of transcendental sense of a radical other. So to give an example, I will be detailing much more momentarily, not a Platonic ideal, not a Christian deity, rather something better than and beyond the current world we're living in, and yet not giving you any kind of ultimate transcendental view. However, it creates a tension between the lived reality and a possibility that exists beyond it. But because that possibility is never going to be articulatable when he thinks it's done right, as something that can be clearly defined, what it means is it creates this constant tension between trying to create a better world here and now, always seeing by definition, limitations of what exists right now. So you're training yourself to see those limitations. And yet the notion of the Tao will not give you an immediate answer as to what a better world would be. It simply gives you this sense of something better. And that better, as we will see, will be articulated radically differently, but it's that tension that matters, which means that actually what's going on here is not a notion of an inherent harmony. It's rather the beginning of a tension between a transcendental realm and mundane reality, but again, worked out in a very distinctive way. I keep emphasizing distinctive because here, Yu Ying-shih will bring in the comparative data. And he will build on the argument of a figure called Karl Jaspers, who very famously in 1949, so several decades before, but at a telling moment, right at the end of World War II, tries to make an argument for universal Enlightenment values. And the way he will do this is to say, all enlightened values are, again, universal. They are found in any great civilization, Jaspers will argue. However, they're not found in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment in the 18th century is simply a late European redevelopment of these ideas. Where it really occurs is in what Karl Jaspers will call, and he's the first to coin this term, the axial age. This period midway through the first millennium BCE, when, according to Jaspers, you get figures like Plato, Aristotle, the Buddha, the Jains, Confucius, Lao Tzu, all at roughly the same time, creating what Jaspers will call a transcendental vision of enlightened values, all of which occur across the board at this time, meaning that we now, in 1949, if we're in Jaspers' shoes, should try to live up to these enlightened values, as obviously he felt was, to put it mildly, horribly failing in the world he was coming from. He grew up, of course, in Germany, and his argument was these are cosmopolitan Enlightenment values held by all great civilizations. To which, as you can probably already see, Yu Ying-shih is saying, no, not really. Yes, he's happy to still use the word transcendental, but he is arguing that the notion of a transcendence that you're getting here is unlike anything you're getting in any other civilization. It is not, and here I will put a little bit more elaboration on a comment I made briefly before, it is not the Platonic notion of radical ideal forms that you are critiquing the mundane reality by. It is rather this notion of a Tao, which is based in an inherent tension, but without giving you a very clear, that's putting it too mildly, without giving you any clear sense of what exactly that higher value will be. That, for Yu Ying-shih, is a new development in China, but again, for him, really in world history. And it does not come out of an assumption, it comes out of an active work by Confucius, precisely through the work we mentioned before of rereading the tradition to open up this possibility. He will then, Yu Ying-shih, will then read the subsequent development of Warring States thought along these lines. And here I won't take you through the details, but suffice to say, his move is to say, with all of the debates going on, where are people building powerfully upon these ideas? And where are they not? And for him, that is the crucial question. Now, immediately you might wonder, well, what is the criterion? Well, again, the criterion will be if he's doing this effectively, because he is putting together an understanding from the point of view of a 20th century historian of what potentialities were in retrospect opened up in ways that would not have been clear at the time, but yet represented, if we can see it precisely correctly, abilities by figures to see things that contemporaries and possibly people for 2,000 years were not seeing, but now if we reconstruct it properly, we can finally see. Now, I might add, when he is doing this, he is doing exactly the sorts of things that Sima Qian, the figure he is directly modeling himself on, was actively doing too. So Sima Qian was doing it much less in terms of the realm of ideas, whereas Yu Ying-shih is interested almost exclusively in ideas. But let me just give you an example from Sima Qian, where this is basically what he's doing. So Sima Qian will very famously give you very counterintuitive readings of figures, and it always comes down to this question: how do specific figures in specific situations respond well or not? So one example, a sort of extreme example, but a telling one for that reason, he gives one entire very close reading of Li Se. So Li Se, of course, is the prime minister of the state of Qin at the time of the Han Dynasty, derided in about the strongest terms you can imagine. And Sima Qian will give this very counterintuitive reading that is ultimately very negative. He thinks Li Se was ultimately wrong. But what's so intriguing about the narrative is for much of his life, Sima Qian will take you through what Li Se was doing and saying, actually, if you see specific moments, he was doing things that now in retrospect, we should see as opening up possibilities. We are mistakenly reading him as being universally bad, which means we are failing to see those possibilities. If we can see those possibilities, it will open things up for us going forward, all the more importantly because Li Se himself then failed to. So at key moments as his career developed, he gets overly taken by his own egotism, his own arrogance. He fails to do what he was doing effectively early in his career. He becomes this very, very dangerous figure. And ultimately, he forecloses the possibilities that he himself had opened up. And hence, you get the horrible tragedy. And Sima Qian's move here is to say, we are replicating that. Whereas, if we go back and see the moments when he opened up possibilities that he himself did not work out, we can reopen those. So the whole move here is to say, how can I, in the early Han, reread that history to open up these possibilities? And I would like to argue that is exactly what Yu Ying-shih is doing. He is simply doing it in the realm of ideas, but this is exactly what he is doing. What ideas were being opened up at precise moments, and how do we show the work that was done to open those up, and the kinds of readings of the tradition that did open those up, and the kinds of readings that ultimately closed them off. So on that ladder, what begins to close it off? By now you're getting a sense, but here let me be explicit. What concerns Yu Ying-shih are the places where that tension, that interplay between sort of a transcendental order and the mundane reality is lost at some level. And specifically, what will concern him are the following sets of things. He feels the most powerful moves are being made when the focus is on inner transcendence. This is something we've noted already beginning with Confucius, with the notion that heaven is a constant companion, that through cultivation, I can gain an ability to rework a ritual tradition. It involves an inward motion. And then Yu Ying-shih will argue, not surprisingly given the way he's framing this, Mencius takes it that next step and develops a fully and very, very powerful vision of an inner transcendence. And other figures lose this in certain ways at first that are very powerful, but in ways that also in retrospect we can see are overly dangerous. So figures who are not so inner focused will, I won't say receive critique from Yu Ying-shih, but certainly be seen as moving in dangerous directions. So the entire movement that will develop by saying, no, it's all about external ritual systems. Those external ritual systems require strong state institutions. For Yu Ying-shih, even when couched in the same terminology of the Tao, cultivation, etc., open up, we can see in retrospect, incredibly dangerous possibilities that will foreclose what he thinks are the most powerful movements. Even things that he likes a great deal, he will say, well, but note how this opens up potential dangers. So Zhuangzi, who he clearly has a great fondness for, but he will say, well, but Zhuangzi is beginning to move a little bit toward an otherworldly direction, which breaks this tension a bit, because you become less concerned, if this is followed out too far, with reordering the current order, because you become overly accessible, one thinks, to another reality. And then he will play out all of these possibilities when you get into the Han Dynasty, where you get an overly strong external vision that forecloses possibilities. You get an active and, in a certain way, good reaction to this with the emergence of what he will call individualism in the Wei Jin period. But again, a response that makes sense and is powerful, and yet is potentially dangerous because it's potentially too individualistic and too opening toward radical individualistic ethics as opposed to reworking the social order. And the argument will continue. Let me now move, and don't worry, this next section will be much briefer because we begin to see the themes. Let me now move to show where and why he is going to take this as we move into later Chinese history. So given this mode of reading, where it's all about how specific figures respond, often, in retrospect, counterintuitively, how we should read them normatively, and what possibilities are opened up, he will then turn to, and now I'm moving to other works, but very much continuing along these same lines, he will then shift to a very counterintuitive, to say the least, reading of the development of the Buddhist tradition, in which he will argue early on Buddhism is overly otherworldly, but then he will say it takes this intriguing turn with Chan Buddhism, because with Chan Buddhism, you reintroduce this tension wherein you get this active concern that transcendence and cultivation requires work in mundane reality. And once that happens, that opens up a rethinking of this entire line that Yu Ying-shih thinks was developing, being foreclosed or not fully developed in all the ways it could have. And counterintuitively, he wants to say, this will become a crucial turning point because this, he will argue, of all things, will actually open up the possibilities for figures like Zhu Xi to make this radical shift of saying, well, once you get this shift developing in Buddhism, this opens up the possibility for rethinking Buddhism in a way that would be strongly based in a social ethic, and hence the Zhu Xi rereading, which Yu Ying-shih will say is coming in part out of possibilities opened up by, of all things, Chan Buddhism, but then requires an active rereading of the entire tradition, which again, Yu Ying-shih will read very, very positively, except there are possibilities being foreclosed. Hence, we move to Wang Yangming, which in his reading opens up yet more possibilities because Wang Yangming's rereading of this yet gives you a greater accessibility to the cultivation possibilities, moving it out of an educated elite into all humans in mundane reality. And then he will move into yet another argument of how, in what he will call the business culture in the 16th through 18th centuries, you get this entire development of kind of a generalization of the possibilities opened up by Wang Yangming, which were in turn opened up by a rereading of Zhu Xi, which in turn was a rereading of Chan Buddhism, and on and on and on. Now, here he introduces yet another side, and bear with me for a few more sentences because you'll see very quickly where I'm going with all of this. I mean, why I want to take you through enough of this narrative to give you a sense of where he's going. So, as you might have gotten a sense from the latter part of this narration, he is then going to make a very strong intervention in the entire way of reading world history based upon a critique of Weber. And very briefly, the move is going to be the following. Weber, very famously, as I'm sure you all know, argued that capitalism uniquely emerges in Europe for many reasons, but the main reason in terms of the realm of ideas is because Calvinism creates this incredible tension among believers in which you have to actively be constantly working and working and working with this incredible anxiety, precisely because there is no possibility of knowing if anything you do will matter, because it's all predestined. And so it creates this incredible anxiety where you have to endlessly work, because if you work and are successful, that by implication would mean you're among the elect who will be able to go to heaven, not because, of course, through working you will get to go to heaven, but rather because you don't know, the very fact that you're working so hard and being successful presumably means you must be in the elect, but because you can't know, you have to, you can't ever stop simply because you've been successful. You have to keep working and keep working and keep working, which for Weber means it creates this insane Protestant work ethic, which again, he calls it Protestant, it's really Calvin, this Calvinistic work ethic, which Weber thought was both incredibly powerful for the development of capitalism, and yet Weber obviously thought it was horrible. It just creates this horrific psychological world. As you're probably getting a sense, Yu Ying-shih is arguing you get something very comparable to Calvinism, but with none of the kind of dangers of what Weber will see as leading ultimately to what he will call the iron cage of modernity. And the argument is, not again that this would have been clear to any of the figures we're mentioning, but if you read the tradition properly, what you can see is the development of a possibility of, yes, a market culture that would involve a generalization of possibilities of full-scale cultivation among a large number of people, not just a literate elite. That activity can be worked through mundane activities, not simply through study, but actually through things like mercantile activity that would involve the same work as a figure like Wang Yangming, reread in this way, is opening up, and as such gives you the possibility of an extraordinarily successful market economy that is in fact a generalization of cultivation techniques based upon this strong tension that we've been articulating, and yet not a tension that is working out in the incredibly dangerous ways that Weber is seeing playing out in Europe. Meaning that once you move into the 20th century, the implication of this would be, if we now, by reading Chinese history this way, see these potentialities, what it means is we can open up the possibility now meaning 20th century, now to rework this tradition. But again, that's what's been going on for the past 2,500 years. But this reworking would entail yet a greater radicalization and generalization of this very tension played out in a particular way that would allow for a certain type of market economy, a certain type of democracy, distinctive from what is developing in Europe, but yet every bit as powerful, and also, crucially for him, coming out of an indigenous tradition in China, not again because of a worldview, but because of this incredible work that's being done. And of course, the implication for Yu Ying-shih is, if this is right, not right in the sense that it's the only way historically to read these events, but right in the sense that it will open up the possibilities he is hoping to give us, if it is right in that sense, it will open up the possibility for an indigenous development of market economy, democracy, visions of human rights, reworked in terms of human dignity, all of which would be traceable back to this work that he has seen working out over the past 2,500 years. Meaning that, going back to his earlier critique, all of these other attempts that he was seeing going on around him at the time to read the possibilities of Chinese civilization in terms of these worldviews that would in themselves solve the world's problems, for Yu Ying-shih, this is why they're so dangerous. Because once you cast this in terms of a worldview, you take out all of that work that both opened up these possibilities, but for Yu Ying-shih, by definition, must be continuing to play out for these possibilities to continue in the future. It is only through the kinds of work that he is doing that he thinks should be done not just by scholars, but by all of us in our daily lives, that all of these possibilities could be realized. So this very briefly, and believe me, this is a very, very brief, quick statement, but this briefly is the argument he is trying to give. Now, having given it in such a quick summary form, let me immediately say a few things that would have been left out of my summary form because they're crucial for the project. So what is being left out of this is precisely what I was referring back to at the very beginning of the talk. All of this is being worked through these incredibly close readings of text after text, in which he will give you these very powerful, often surprising and counterintuitive readings that are often intentionally being done with critiques of those around him, often very implicit, but always through these close readings that are always being done in terms of working out these openings and possibilities, and clearly calling on us to judge him on that, not of whether it's right, because again, you can read all of these from different perspectives, rather to judge him on whether or not it does successfully open up these possibilities along the lines of what he is arguing needs to be done. And let me add a further point to this in terms of the implications of what he's doing for situating Chinese history vis-a-vis the larger world. Note already with the two figures we've mentioned, and there are many more, but just the two figures, you're already getting a sense of it. So Karl Jaspers, I mentioned, is one. Max Weber, I mentioned, is a second. Both of these figures for Yu Ying-shih are powerful in a sense. They both open up ways of thinking about European history from a comparative point of view. He also thinks both are wrong. I'm almost tempted to say dangerously wrong, but Yu Ying-shih is polite, especially with Jaspers, but I don't think dangerously wrong is putting it too strongly, and that's for the following reason. Both figures, for all of their differences, but both figures are absolutely committed to some kind of a notion of, I won't call it an inherent teleology. Certainly for Weber, it's not a teleology in a strong sense, but some notion that there are inherent stages you must go through if there is going to be development. Now, for Jaspers, that's clear. Like you must go through the axial age period to become enlightened. That's clearly the case. Weber, it's less clearly the case because he's against overt teleologies. However, it is clear for Weber there absolutely is an evolutionary line that you must go through if you're going to become a rationalized modern society. What will happen, according to Weber, that will get you there can be kind of random. It's random that Calvinism arises. It's random that this radical view of predestination will have the impact it will have. So the exact events that will occur to move one up or keep one from moving up will vary. But for Weber as well, there is a rationalization that will go on, and either you're going to become more and more rational or you will fail. Now, for Yu Ying-shih, he thinks this is, again, dangerous, but yet note, he's also not saying it's completely mistaken. What he wants to do is, and I don't think this is an unfair way to put it, he wants to reread both Jaspers and Weber, and those are just two examples of the many he will deal with, in the exact same way he's rereading every one we've been talking about. So how do we reread Jaspers? How do we reread Weber to see these potentials that in both cases they opened and yet foreclosed because they held themselves back by these pre-given schema, which means he's making an argument overtly for the development of Chinese civilization implicitly, but it's not that implicit, it's borderline explicit. He is making an argument for comparative history. And he is trying to argue both Jaspers and Weber are onto something. They open things up, but they're both wrong in a very fundamental way. Not just for China by definition. I think he is implicitly saying they're kind of wrong for Europe too. Not in specific elements of the analyses, like he thinks Weber is really onto something with Calvinism. He thinks that's absolutely onto something. The foreclosing of possibilities is this vision that there is one inherent way, not that for Calvinism, but one inherent way that you will rationalize if these random things like Calvinism occur that push you upward. And what he is trying to say is, well, let's take this mode of reading I'm developing for the Chinese tradition coming out of indigenous historiography and reread the great social theorists from the West too, with the exact same hermeneutics. In other words, how would we reread the great figures in European social theory from this point of view as well? What are they opening up for ways we can rethink what is going on? And he thinks there are many such ways. For Weber's reading of Calvinism, his consequent reading of Chan Buddhism, moving into very early Song Neo-Confucianism and then the radical developments later. But ultimately, Weber gets it wrong. And by bringing a mode of reading from the Chinese tradition into the analysis, it opens up a different comparative possibility. Why do I emphasize that? Because, and here we're moving into territory that he's not explicit about, but I think is there enough to warrant what I'm about to say. I think the ultimate implication of this would be, yes, Yu Ying-shih is doing this in terms of Chinese history. The ultimate way of working this out, and I kind of think if we had been lucky enough to have him with us for another couple of decades, this might really have occurred. The ultimate implication will be a rethinking of world history too, like a rethinking of world history precisely because in the 20th century, and all the more so for us, but in the 20th century, he was living in a world where all of these issues, capitalism, democracy, human rights, these were no longer European concepts. These were part of a world culture that everyone had to wrestle with. And what he wanted to say was, we can learn to wrestle with them only by developing the kinds of techniques that we're talking about. If we stick to this worldview, the Western worldview as you know, transcendental order, mundane reality, as opposed to a notion of inherent harmony in China, we'll never wrestle with these issues, right? You'll always be stuck with this radical dichotomy. And one of the lines he will repeat over and over again is we need to break down this dichotomy of China and the West, which may sound surprising for someone who's so committed to saying, I want to work out of the indigenous Chinese tradition, but I think it's not contradictory at all. I think he's saying, working out of the indigenous Chinese tradition, it will allow us, if we read it properly, to break down all of these distinctions. And means we will cease to think of things like capitalism, democracy, etc., as being European or Western. And then the question is, do they or do they not work in a Chinese context? For Yu Ying-shih, this is a dangerously misasked question. Whatever the answer is, but it's a misasked question. Rather, this rereading of history opens up a possibility for rethinking market cultures, rethinking political activity, rethinking ethics, along with, of course, rethinking the very mode of doing historiography in a way that would be opening to a fully comparative world history. Sima Qian was not worried about this because he had no access to this, nor was it a problem. Now it's a problem. And now, building on this tradition, we can actually begin wrestling with it seriously. Now, if this is onto anything with what he was hoping to do, let me now turn to the next question of this. Where would this take us? So sadly, he is no longer with us. We're still on the planet though, and we can read him. And where would this take us were we to take this seriously? And obviously, I think we should take it seriously. So let me offer a few suggestions. And let me begin with just a few general points. So let's put Yu Ying-shih not just in the field of 20th century Chinese intellectuals, which is the field we've mainly been discussing so far. Let's now put it into this next stage that I was touching on at the last part of my talk, world history. And let me turn to the West for the simple reason that it has become the dominant imperial power, and it's therefore the one that dangerously was creating these dichotomies of West versus China that Yu Ying-shih wanted to push us against. So are there figures in 20th century Western thinking, I'll just call them Euro-American thinking, that are comparable to what Yu Ying-shih is doing? Yes and no. And I mention this to underline a point he's making about his own project that I think we should really take seriously. So the yes part is clear. Are there thinkers in Europe and America in the 20th century, and let's expand it to the 19th century when the whole topic of modernity became such a hot topic in European thought, are there big figures who are doing something kind of like what Yu Ying-shih is doing? In other words, trying to say, can we work across the entire Western tradition to make an argument as to how and why we are where we are in this era of a self-proclaimed modernity? The answer, of course, is yes. In fact, you could argue that's the dominant paradigm of 19th and 20th century Euro-American thought. But note what I think a Yu Ying-shih would immediately pop in to say, which is, no one is doing this the way Yu Ying-shih is doing it for the Chinese, or ultimately, I will argue, for world history either. All of the discussions that are being done by figures who would be self-proclaimed philosophers, which, as Yu Ying-shih notes constantly, is seen as a distinct work from what an historian will do. So Hegel will, of course, make grand philosophical arguments for the emergence of modernity. Nietzsche will make anti-Hegelian arguments, sort of genealogies intentionally designed to break down an Hegelian narrative and any kind of a notion that liberal humanism is somehow a good thing. Thereafter, you'll get people coming out of Nietzsche, Heidegger, much later of Foucault, also doing genealogies, trying to break down our assumptions of modernity. So you get both the modernity arguments and the critiques of those arguments, but these are all by self-proclaimed philosophers who will, and happily so, I would argue, not claim to be giving you accurate, close readings of specific figures in the Western tradition. In fact, it kind of works the other way. So to give Nietzsche as an obvious example, Nietzsche will very happily give you, and intentionally so, these very strong, I don't think it's going too far to say, misreadings of the tradition that work because they're so powerful and so, like, Christianity is nothing but resentment against the power holders, and he wants to go back to Greek aristocracy. I mean, it's just these bizarre narratives that work if they work because they're just so counterintuitive. And he makes no attempt to say this is an accurate, close reading of specific people. It works because it is such a powerful misreading that, in his perspective, will open up the possibilities of critiquing assumptions that people in late 19th century Europe were taking for granted. So the power of it lies in the philosophical critique with a powerful set of misreadings. Needless to say, Yu Ying-shih's critique of this would be the obvious one, which is to say, no, you really need to be trying to give accurate, close readings of these texts. Now, you're doing it in a way that, of course, is based upon your current position. You're doing it assuming that there are different perspectives and different possibilities, but that's the point. You are doing it to see what those possibilities are, and a good critique would only be one that is showing, no, other possibilities are opened up by reading it a different way. So he's doing something fundamentally different than that entire body of scholarship. We've already noted the body of social scientific literature with figures like Weber, who develops the whole field of historical sociology, and we've noted the critique he would give of that you're still based upon a notion of an inherent evolution, even if you're adding in that it's random how you move from stage to stage, but there is still an evolution. And for Yu Ying-shih, no, that's too dangerous. It will, by definition, foreclose possibilities because you're not going to be reading closely once you have foreordained where things are going to have to work out. Like, by definition, even if Weber's reading of Calvinism is powerful, it pre-answers what it must be doing. Maybe it's right in that respect, but in general, you will not be doing close readings. And indeed, Weber is absolutely guilty of the very thing Yu Ying-shih will so strongly critique figures of his own era, looking at Chinese history, worldview analysis. Weber will strongly say there's this Confucian worldview in which everyone is being taught to simply accept the world they're born into, which, as Yu Ying-shih says, is just ridiculous. I mean, that is obviously a misreading of the tradition, but it's a misreading that comes from a Weberian view that, by definition, you have to have worldviews that will either hold you back or allow you to move up these evolutions. So I mention all of this to make the following point. There aren't clear analogs to Yu Ying-shih's project in 19th and 20th century Euro-American thought. There are lots of people doing the sorts of things that he can build upon, but no one who's quite doing what he's doing. Or going back to Yu Ying-shih's way of putting it, he is really building out of an indigenous tradition that really does open possibilities that you were not seeing dominant elsewhere in the 19th and 20th century Euro-American literature. And of course, his critique is, let's stop taking these Euro-American models, let's build out of the indigenous tradition and see how we can rethink everything. So I make that point for a reason that I'm sure is now obvious, but let me now be explicit. What if he's right? Or putting it more in a Yu Ying-shih way of thinking, what if this really does open possibilities for us? Now, by definition, we would do the work somewhat differently than Yu Ying-shih. So even the book I was mentioning a few moments ago, 2014, a lot has happened since then. And obviously in the decades to come, a lot more will be happening. And Yu Ying-shih will say, well, of course, that's the point. It is all about people responding in situations, but the key is you're training yourself to try to respond effectively. And part of that training, by definition, not the only one for him, but part of that training comes through the kinds of training to do close readings of texts that will allow you to trace out these possibilities, which, if you do it effectively, is the same work you're doing, allowing you to read situations in common day reality, to see possibilities when they arise, to act in ways that open up those possibilities. For Yu Ying-shih, this, I think, is the key body of ethics that he wants to build on. He wants to say this is a vision of ethics that emerges early in the Chinese tradition, is developed in radical and often very counterintuitive ways. It risks being foreclosed by different ways of reading that tradition. Opened up, it allows them. And again, this final piece of it, he clearly, at that final stage, wanted to open this up to a comparative understanding. How would we rethink all of world history were we to take this seriously? So let me now conclude by touching on that final point. If we are going to take this point of view seriously, again, I clearly think we should, what it would be a call for is something that doesn't really exist now, and yet perhaps should. And I'll just use an odd phrasing because it doesn't exist, but a comparative form of cultural and intellectual history in which ideas and values are taken seriously, in which the mode of reading the historical process is taken seriously as an act that potentially opens up possibilities, in which you are doing it explicitly from a comparative perspective, precisely because we are living in a moment when, if we fail to do so, we will not be living up to the moment. We are living in a moment where you must work across cultures, but even the term of culture as distinctive worldview, again, forecloses possibilities. So what would it mean to work without such a notion? What would it mean to actually do such a form of large-scale comparative intellectual history? Again, I think he is pointing the way. He didn't work out the full comparative implications, but I strongly suspect if he were here, he would say, that's precisely where we need to go. So looking at, among other things, a lot of young people, let me say, think of this as a way to go. Think of this as a way to go. We are facing problems that Yu Ying-shih already had a sense of. They're getting worse, much worse than even he lived to see. They are going to get much, much, much worse in the decades to come. And maybe, just maybe, he is giving us a way to think through how to navigate these issues in a larger comparative way that breaks the kinds of frameworks that we usually think in, that breaks the kinds of disciplinary boundaries we usually operate within, and perhaps would allow both for seeing possibilities we are otherwise not seeing, and precisely by doing so, to train ourselves to be able to see these potentialities in our lives in ways that, again, we fail to see. And if we begin putting this into practice, what I think a Yu Ying-shih would say is the implication would be opening up possibilities for ourselves and for future generations that we otherwise would not see. We would even foreclose as possibilities, and the dangers of that for us, and again, for those future generations, if they exist, would be extraordinary. I think what he is calling on is nothing less than a rethinking of world history and the ethics of doing world history. It is an extraordinary vision I think he is laying out for us, not immediately apparent because it's done so implicitly, and yet according to his own way of thinking, it has to be, because it has to be based upon this incredibly close, nuanced reading of the past, of the present, with possibilities for the future. In short, I think he is giving us an incredibly powerful vision, not of what should happen, by definition he couldn't, but of the kinds of work we could be doing to open up those possibilities. It's a powerful vision that I would love if we could learn to take deeply, deeply seriously. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Yu, and thank you for opening us the possibilities for listening to the Ying-shih and his great legacy. But now we are open up for questions now. So
Wonderful.
yeah. So any questions for Professor Puett?
I'll leave labor for your next talk. That's the topic.
Indeed, it is indeed.
But on the general argument that we're giving,
Yes.
let me, obviously, first of all, I think some agreement that I have in the spectrum that I can put forward a disagree.
Indeed.
Ying-shih, in many cases, and I haven't read all of them, and very little of the early history, he was a very good historian in the sense that, especially when he got down to his Song Dynasty book, he could put these people in the logic of the situation. And so he could work out why they were moving a certain way and why they were disagreeing or that. So I think we agree.
Yes.
And that much is Ying-shih is a good historian. Secondly, we also agree that intellectual historians like to take their work from written texts.
Right.
And obviously, you only read texts that have been written.
Right.
So they read backwards. And Simontian would have read Confucius, and other people would have read it as
Yes.
and so on. And in that sense, there is a discourse over the ages.
Yes.
So they answer one another's questions.
Precisely.
And they work as a community.
Yes.
But having said that, where would you put, for example, I was trying to, age is getting to me, names don't come easily. The Italian historian who wrote about the cheese and the worms.
Oh, yes, Ginsburg, Carlo Ginsburg.
Ginsburg,
Yes.
that's right.
Yes.
What about Natalie Davis?
Yes.
With all these unimportant people?
Yes.
Now, those guys didn't write books.
Yes.
So
Yes.
your Yu Ying-shih and the people following on your advice of working the Yu Ying-shih way wouldn't hit upon those people.
Yes, that's right.
And in that case, are you not advocating that the historian is actually about the ordinary person? That in fact, he sorts of picks and chooses what represents an age. And my question then would be, what authority would you be drawing on
Yes.
to make that suggestion?
Yes. Yeah, no, I think it's a wonderful question. And I don't think he has a full answer, but I think he has hints that at least we could build on for an answer. And the reason I put it that way is absolutely, he is an intellectual historian, so he is exclusively looking at, precisely as you said, intellectuals, how they respond to situations, and he finds out by reading texts. And absolutely, he is extraordinary because he commands the entire tradition, but he commands the entire tradition, as you said, of figures who are actively responding to and rereading each other. So exactly as you said, to work out this project, one where he explicitly says it's all about reacting to even common mundane reality, exactly as you said, what about the fact that that would mean we're looking at people who weren't part of this conversation, who weren't writing these texts, who therefore we have no access to? Now, let me give a somewhat odd beginning to the question, but I do it for a reason that will become obvious momentarily. Sima Qian himself mentions this. So Sima Qian himself opens up his Liezhuan section by saying, okay, the truth is I'm going to write histories of people that I have records of. I'm going to write those records because those records will not only exist, but tell certain stories that I can build upon. What about the countless numbers of people who have lived? Many died horrible deaths. Many have done extraordinary things that will be forgotten for all of history. What about those figures who actually did these extraordinary things, but were only mentioned that I have access to by figures in specific situations that lead me to totally misread them? And that's where he opens up his biography section. Now, that's Sima Qian, but let me now jump to Yu Ying-shih. He doesn't explicitly deal with this, but he borders on it. And the place where he's bordering on it is in this work he was doing, which I mentioned only momentarily, so I'll say a few more words about it, on the business culture of 16th through 18th century China. Now, by definition, he's working with documents, so it still involves the same restrictions we just mentioned, but here he is actively trying to get a sense of how people were doing the sorts of things that he's looking at outside of the intellectual realm. And he's dealing with written sources, so by definition, he's looking at those who we have examples of. But of course, going back to your examples, this is what Carlo Ginzburg is doing too. So he'll give us the cheese and the worms because it so happens this one figure is called up to the Inquisition, and therefore we get statements from the Inquisition records of what he was doing. And Yu Ying-shih is doing, not to that extreme, but he's doing something like that in getting at the business culture. Now, I mentioned that to say for us, coming in this next stage after Yu Ying-shih, could we do more of that? In other words, if he is really doing this pretty much exclusively, minus the examples I mentioned with the business culture, pretty much exclusively with intellectuals, could we take this same set of questions, even same technique of reading, and open it up to the larger realm? And doing so, I think, would be living up to Yu Ying-shih's own arguments, because he's explicitly saying, this is the sort of way we should be living our daily lives. So I would like to say developing that, not to imply it's easy, but developing that would in a sense be fully living up to that vision. Or answering in a slightly different way, you could read, do a Yu Ying-shih reading of Carlo Ginzburg and say, isn't this kind of what Carlo Ginzburg is trying to do, right? Carlo Ginzburg is trying to work through the Inquisitions to give us this figure otherwise lost to history, and through that figure, allowing to see how one figure, otherwise lost to us, is building out this incredibly complicated, radically eclectic, from our point of view, vision of the world. And how does this force us to rethink our understanding of what we think of as Christian culture once we see what this one figure is doing that so cuts against our own readings? And of course, Yu Ying-shih would then say, play that out fully, and you get a hint of the kind of project he's talking about, but precisely as you said, no longer restricted simply to great intellectuals reading great texts within one self-defined tradition. So yeah, I think your critique is both accurate and I think opening up a possibility that we should actively be pursuing. So thank you. Please, yeah, follow up, please. Please, yes.
Following that line of thought, then you are saying that you will not just be reading people and texts.
Right.
You might be reading machines.
Yes.
And objects.
Yes.
And you started off this lecture referring to archaeology.
Yes.
That would in fact would not be a text. It would be
Yes.
material from
Definitely.
which you'll be writing text.
Yes.
Now, that's not quite the same thing. Yu Ying-shih never quite said,
Yeah.
you read outside text.
Right.
So you have to
agree.
make that jump
Yes.
if you want to push this argument.
Yeah, no, I think that's well put. I think it would require a jump. I think you're right. He never does that. So even in the example I mentioned of the business culture, 16th through 18th century in China, as you said, he's really looking exclusively at text. He's looking at the places where he can find a merchant doing the sorts of work he's talking about, which by definition, you know where he's working. These are texts that he has access to that made it into the tradition for exactly the reasons you're mentioning. So you're absolutely right. It would require a jump. I would like to say that's the sort of jump that taking this position seriously would, in a sense, call on us to do. Like we are to really do the kind of expansion I was touching on at the end of my talk. We should be willing to take that jump because it would open us into realms that Yu Ying-shih himself didn't go down, and yet to really do the kind of project I think he was hinting toward the end of his life, it would require that jump. So yeah, I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So we have some questions from the online panel.
Ah, great, wonderful.
Probably we got waiting for. So thank you for a wonderful talk. Why do you think the future is worse? It's a very broad question. How will the adoption of Professor Yu's reading Chinese history will help Chinese intellectuals to feel peace in the future? Oh, that's quite
Yes.
emotional one. Yeah.
It's very, yeah, wonderful question. Thank you. So why do I think it's worse? So I'll paint a slightly bleak picture, but bear with me for a moment because the argument will be if we're taking Yu Ying-shih seriously, the bleak picture is the dangerous one, right? The focus would be the potentialities we're not seeing. But I'll paint it bleakly for a moment, not seeing the potentialities. So there is a very realistic possibility that in the lifetimes of many of us in this audience, the climate disaster could reach a point where the refugee crisis in the world could be not just 6 or 7 million as it was during the rise of the huge neo-rightist movements of a few years ago. We could be talking about tens of millions of people. This could lead to the rise of very, very strong militaristic states in response, the emergence of wars, all of which would, of course, dramatically increase the horrors of the climate devastation we're talking about. And you could easily imagine a sort of snowball effect of things just getting worse and worse and worse. That's one example. Needless to say, at the moment in the geopolitical world, there are very, very obvious tensions playing out that could easily move us into also wars at levels that humanity has never faced before. And I could continue the bleak pictures on, but I mention all of this to get back to the heart of your question, which is to say, if we stay painting things the way I just did, that's incredibly dangerous because, of course, it creates an implicit sense that these forces are so large, there is nothing we can do to stop them. Yu Ying-shih would immediately say, no, that's an incredibly dangerous way to think. There are always going to be potentials we're not seeing. And so what you're training yourself to do is to try to see those potentials. You're in part seeing those potentials by the way you understand the world around you. Those attempts would involve, I think this is where he's pushing toward the end of his career, a comparative understanding, like how ideas that have arisen in different parts of the world, how practices, getting back to David's question, that have arisen in different parts of the world could be built upon in ways that are very right now counterintuitive. And through that reading, would possibilities for rethinking the world around us be there? Yu Ying-shih would say, of course they would be there. And we're training ourselves to do it. So I began with a bleak picture, but of course, Yu Ying-shih would immediately say that bleak picture comes from one way of reading the future based upon one way of reading the past. And what are we failing to do if we read it that way? Or putting it more positively, what could we do to open up possibilities we're not seeing? So thank you, a wonderful question.
we have been waiting for the other online questions. But, any questions? Colleagues and friends?
In a sense, is objectivity about the deep reading and the text.
Yes.
I think that method is very important. I think he certainly he's not a pure positive in the sense that everything you read as a truth, you're trying to dig out the truth. He is not that kind.
Yes.
I think exactly because of deep reading requirement is a very important methodology to dig out possibilities or opportunities and so forth. So that must be some kind of concern about the bias in the deep reading. If you are biased, you start with bias, the deeper you go, the deeper your bias, right?
Exactly.
And actually, he was lucky that he retired sort of quite some time ago. And my understanding is in particular 10 years or even 5 years in American campuses, including Harvard, this kind of bias in a sense is ideology.
Right.
That's just really, really,
yes.
really difficult for, in particular, historians, because
Yes.
historians are like some other disciplines. In other disciplines, you don't really need to talk about facts. Historians still need to talk about facts, but in the last 5-6 years, even in America, in the media, in the historical field, what is fact is really going through a very sort of upheaval. I mean, what do we talk about facts now?
Yes.
But people work on facts, right? I mean, in the business field, in the society, everyone seems to have a set of facts, but the facts are, we don't know what fact it is. So
Exactly.
how are you going to, let's say, suggest Professor Yu's sort of this comparative method, world history, global sort of a vision of comparative cross-culture, deep reading, historical, intellectual history kind of methodology can help us to get to feel more comfortable, just not to find the truth, but just feel more comfortable when facing all these variety of facts in reality.
Yes.
Any suggestion on that? I'm sure many students ask you maybe.
Yes, no, wonderful question. And I'll begin by picking up a theme that you mentioned right at the beginning, because I think it really cuts to the heart of it. You're absolutely right. One of the key things Yu Ying-shih would immediately emphasize, and this is just a constant throughout his work, is, as you said, a critique of ideology. So I was mentioning before the attempts by various figures to think of a worldview. That's one critique, but he would expand that exactly as you said. Any kind of an ideology that will give you answers, he saw as inherently dangerous. And that is a consistent critique. It's a consistent critique of historians around him of the day. It's a consistent critique of political actors who he thinks are in danger of making various forms of thinking from the Chinese past into new isms, new ideologies that he finds to be incredibly dangerous. And here too, he's building on Sima Qian, who was incredibly, intensely critical of ideologies. And so for him, Sima Qian, it was always a question, as we mentioned, of giving these surprising counterintuitive readings that are aimed precisely at trying to break us from pre-given answers. And that is clearly, as I mentioned, what I think Yu Ying-shih is in part modeling himself upon, trying to give us these readings that would surprise us to break down a pre-given understanding. And I mention this in answer to the question because I think he would at least argue, and I'd like to say there's something to this, that the practice of deep reading, it's not the only practice, like again, with his discussions of the business culture, he's very clear, it's not the only one, like the greater expansion, the better, but it is certainly for him a key way of developing this, that if you are learning deep reading, you will hopefully be hitting things that will surprise you in text, that will push back against our assumptions, that will push back against our pre-given worldviews, our pre-given ideologies, and the ethic of doing that, the ethic of training oneself to read closely, read deeply, be surprised, have text push back at us. For him, that is the kind of ethic we're trying to develop in daily life too, of not simply living our lives with pre-given assumptions, but allowing ourselves to see reality as this very complex world of, at least if we act properly in it, of potentialities. So I think he would say deep reading is one of the possible ways of developing these ethics. Now, as I mentioned in response to David, again, he doesn't develop this fully, but the implication of the work he's doing on business culture in the 16th through 18th centuries, he's trying to say, part of what's powerful about that is you're getting people who are trying to do this in mundane reality, which for him is equally crucial. So he's not saying you must be a deep reader of Chinese intellectual history to gain this. He thinks this is something we're all capable of gaining, but I think it's a telling example for him, not just because he's a practitioner of it, but a telling example too, because getting back to the heart of your question, training oneself to do that means training oneself not to have a pre-understanding of what the world already is, or getting back to your example too, a pre-given understanding of what a fact is. So what we define as a fact often has a lot to do with the world we have created to define X as a fact. And if you're learning to read carefully, the world pushes back on us in ways that will even push us to rethink what we think is a fact and what we think is not. So yeah, thank you. Wonderful question.
We have still 15 minutes to go. So any questions? Professor Deng.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for the wonderful lecture. And mainly a question of clarification. I wonder whether the sort of grand project that you read of Professor Yu, and possibly also your own evocation, can we say is a sort of normative history in a sense, maybe possibly first in the sense that ideas and values are unavoidable in our reading of histories and understanding the course of human history, but also maybe at the second level, whether we should have a certain conception of some general values of humanities in order to appreciate those, what you say, potentiality and possibilities, or it doesn't matter, different people can see different possibilities, because it seems potentiality and possibility depends a lot on our interpretation and values, and that seems to be a problem. And in your suggestion, whether it doesn't matter, different people simply can interpret different possibility, or we need to have some general sense of like human values in order to grasp with these potentialities. So yeah. two part of it.
Yeah, no, great question. And it absolutely cuts to the heart of what I think he was trying to do. And let me answer by returning to the comparison I was making between Sima Qian and Yu Ying-shih, because this point is a place where there's more of a difference, I think, than Yu Ying-shih would want to say there is. So with Sima Qian, I don't think, Sima Qian is clearly giving a normative history, right? I think he is clearly making very strong critiques of people. He is clearly, certainly figures of his own day, he is clearly critiquing the ways history was being read to lead up to his own day. He is clearly trying to find potentials that were closed off, that he thinks could be revived. So it is clearly, in that sense, a normative vision of history in the sense that he wants to open up possibilities. That being said, and I mean this as a compliment to him, he does not give us any kind of a sense of what exactly that's going to mean. It's very unclear, like concretely, okay, what does he think about Han Wudi's vision? It's obviously critical, but okay, what would you do, Sima Qian? And I think he's not going to give us an answer to that, because I think he's saying, I'm opening up these possibilities, but I'm not going to give you a vision of where this is going to take us. Now, I think all of what I just said could also be made of Yu Ying-shih, but maybe not quite as strongly. I think Yu Ying-shih gives us more, and for better or for worse. But I mentioned this to get back to what you're really getting at here. So with Yu Ying-shih, he's doing all that I just mentioned. He's trying to reread the past, to see these potentialities, see how they've opened up. So normative in that sense, but he's also normative in a stronger sense. Like, it is very clear when you read him that he thinks there's a good strand of Chinese history that he wants to expand, and going quickly, that good strand is one that's focused on inward development. It is focused on a development of what will later, by the 16th century, become a very strong commitment to sincerity. It involves a kind of pushing against ritual, but ultimately even a borderline anti-ritual position. The implication for the 20th century would be, he would see that this is coming out of the Chinese tradition, but clearly it's coming out of the Chinese tradition coming through Mengzi, Mencius, Jushi, Wang Yangming, etc. You could obviously give a very different genealogy that would give a radically different way of reading possibilities that he would oppose. So he clearly has a vision of where things should go to a much greater extent than Sima Qian ever would give us. Now, that's for better or for worse, and I say this because I think it really gets to the heart of your question. Yu Ying-shih he's going to be a lot less, I was going to say a lot less open. That's a very un-Yu Ying-shih way of saying it, so I'll take that. I won't use that term, but the reason I was thinking of saying it is he does have a vision, and clearly by his own terms, he doesn't want that to foreclose possibilities. By definition, he thinks that will open up possibilities, but also by his own argument, he would need to be open to someone saying, well, has that reading of the tradition emphasizing one specific line, is that perhaps, yes, opening up some possibilities? Are there other possibilities it is closing? And what could those be? Which would mean he would have to be committed to, exactly as you said, a community of people actively wrestling with these issues. And if he is willing to go further than, say, a Sima Qian is in terms of making a philosophical argument of where we should go, if he's living up to his own vision, would have to be equally open to being critiqued for the vision that he is giving us. So for better or for worse, Sima Qian will say much less about where to go. Yu Ying-shih will say a lot more. Both, I think, would say, to live up to this philosophy, you need to be open to the kinds of communities of critiques that this requires. Again, for better or for worse, and I think it cuts both ways, Yu Ying-shih is giving us a much more forceful vision than, say, a Sima Qian ever would have done. And in a sense, a way to think of that is he puts more on the plate for us to wrestle with, in a sense, in terms of a clear normative claim that a Sima Qian would never, ever go so far as to give us so clearly. So thank you. Wonderful question. Yeah, it just cuts to the heart of this. Yes.
Do you have any more questions? Actually, I have some questions, but of course, I will leave the opportunities to the audience here. Please.
I recall in Qianlu's final famous essay, he says, I was just going to try to pull up my phone, but I can't remember. He says something to the effect that what he's identified in the Tian Ren He Yi, that notion of Tian is a universal contribution to humanity.
Yes.
And is China's unique contribution.
Yes.
But my wrestling with it is not clear what he's pointing to exactly.
Yeah.
And if I recall true, maybe Yu Ying-shih in that book on that topic says that he's going to try to explicate what that is. But I still didn't get it.
Yep.
So I'm turning to you, the expert, and seeing if you can tell us, is it this historiography? Is that what it is? Is it this heaven, vision of heaven that is closer at hand and undefined, but provides a moral critique without being too imposing in that Platonic way that you were referencing, or is it something else?
Yeah. So great question. My reading, and this is very implicit, so in terms of what Yu Ying-shih is doing, so I'm throwing this out as a possibility, and those of you who would like to push back, please feel free to do so. He's not explicit on this. I actually think this is a place where Yu Ying-shih is in a very intriguing Yu Ying-shih way, pushing back against his teacher, but pushing back exactly along the lines that I was mentioning. He's pushing back not by saying, you're wrong, Chen-mu. He's pushing back by saying, well, let's reread this and see what possibilities are there that Chen-mu was getting at if we read him in this following way. And the reason I put it that way is I think what might be going on there is he is saying, if this is onto anything, that Chen-mu is buying a little bit too much into the Tianren He ideology, going a little bit too far than he should have. And I think in part, Yu Ying-shih's critique is, I don't think Chen was the main object of it, but I think it's an object of it. And I think he is saying that entire way of thinking, the way it's being phrased, is not wrong, but just dangerous in the way it's being phrased. And that Chen-mu is going a little bit too far along those lines. And hence what I, Yu Ying-shih, am going to do on the contrary, is give you this mode of reading that will show you why the notion of heaven becomes so crucial. But of course, in Yu Ying-shih's reading, and this gets back to the heart of your question, it isn't really heaven, it's the Tao. And in Yu Ying-shih's reading, what the Tao is always undefinable, but always in a sense, it's a practice. It's close to the world we live in, but distinct from the world we live in. It requires an active critical attention to the world we live in without giving us clear answers. And none of that, I think, would be a critique of Chen-mu, but the argument would be Chen-mu is in danger by the way he's phrasing it of moving away from that. And then Yu Ying-shih's reading, if this is onto anything, would be a way of saying, let me give you a hermeneutic for a more powerful way of reading this tradition that would open up more possibilities. So I think it's again, I want to say a strong critique of his teacher, but a Yu Ying-shih type of critique, a rereading of Chen-mu to give possibilities that Chen-mu himself, perhaps, at least according to Yu Ying-shih, in his phrasings, was not quite saying. Again, that's a guess as to what's going on there, but I do think there's good textual evidence to imply that might be what's going on. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I guess we have a few time for like one more question, one more short question. Any questions?
Yes, please.
So we thank you for the conversation that's going on here, and also on this tendency, right? So
Yes.
the boundary between heaven and that's very interesting. I think one of the big problems there is really what can
Yes, precisely.
can is difficult, but learn also difficult.
Very, very.
So they're talking about but actually you don't know what's
Exactly. Yeah. What's being heard and what's eat. Exactly. Yes.
If you can't distinguish heaven from man, you don't have.
Exactly.
So I think that concept of a can.
Yeah.
I don't know, my question, I know it's not a short question, but let me see what
Please, please.
I have a feeling that translating that into heaven, the modern region, you go back to the tradition, but I think that can be very misleading.
Yeah.
If you use heaven to translate can, if you tell a non-Chinese,
Yeah.
Chinese, but
But
if you talk to people who don't know Chinese at all,
Yes.
I'm sure they got a complete wrong.
Absolutely.
Of what they
Yes.
say.
Yes.
Chinese whatever you call it.
Yes.
So I have a sort of idea that maybe we should drop that translation of heaven. Instead, we use can.
Yeah. Yes.
I don't know that either, right?
Yes.
They
Yes.
They don't know what they won't get.
Exactly.
They won't misunderstood.
Yes.
I think in the last 100 years, a lot of misunderstanding about China. I mean, difficulty between
Yes.
this cross-cultural understanding.
Yes.
Exactly, is because of word heaven.
Yes.
That work is particularly important because it's so important in Chinese tradition.
Yes.
I mean, no matter how you interpret it, different people interpret it different way, but still, in every philosophy, school, religion, or anything, or even daily life, or for communists, that is important. Even for communists, 10 is very important, right?
Yes,
They live under the
yes.
10 So without understanding the 10 in the Chinese tradition or society, probably very difficult to
Yes.
really get what they have in their mind. I mean, for the Chinese have in their mind. But unfortunately, we try and find this heaven there. And I think it's really, it's a barrier. Now, that's my feeling. I don't know how you react to that.
Oh, I agree strongly. And let me just add to the point. So when we translate Tian as heaven, as you said, it just brings in all of these restrictive connotations of the term that utterly miss the way it's being actively worked and reworked in the tradition, and also, as you said, even in daily life. And to go back to what another one of Yu Ying-shih's critiques too, when Tian is translated as nature, as he explicitly says, but it doesn't mean nature. Like, it's just simply wrong. Exactly. And so either translation, heaven, or again, arguably even worse, nature, is incredibly dangerous. And part of what's intriguing when you look at Yu Ying-shih, and I say this because I think he would completely agree with what you're saying, is he will read different readings of Tian and show this out. And so he will show, like, to give you one of his favorite examples, which he comes back to over and over again, what Sima Qian means by heaven is so different from what Mencius means by heaven, which is so, well, he won't quite say so different from what Confucius does, but he wants to say there's a fundamental shift there, and yet you can only understand the implications of each of these three figures in terms of how they are rereading the previous figures, rereading of the notion of Tian. And so getting back to your point, this would mean anytime we translate it, we give a fixed reading, whereas what interest Yu Ying-shih is to say, and it also goes back to the previous question too, it's this incredibly complicated, endless play between what we could define at one moment as humanity, what we could define as one moment of Tian, but only at one moment, because the whole point is this constant reinterpretation of both vis-a-vis the other, and that is what interests him for the tradition. And he thinks all of these different formulations, all of these translations risk losing that, which means we misread these texts, or even worse for him, we read the text in these very sort of clearly defined ways that miss what is really going on in terms of what is actually being opened up by their moves. So yes, I think that's exactly right. Yes, thank you.
Great, I think we got a perfect time control here. So it's exactly 55. So I guess we give one more big applause to Professor Puett.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you once again for joining us this afternoon for the first lecture of the Yu Ying-shih Lecture in History 2023-2024. The second lecture will be held on the coming Sunday, the 5th November at 3 p.m. at the Hong Kong Museum of History. You're welcome to scan the QR code on the back page of the lecture booklet and fill in the online opinion survey to share with us your views. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you again soon.
I like the comment very much.